As the Switch coasts into its final years, I think it's worth stepping back and considering just how many The Legend of Zelda games the console has received since its launch in 2017. A healthy mix of brand new entries and remakes. Yet, as you'd expect from the series, each game always managed to feel suitably fresh. And this goes doubly true for The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom. You see, for the first time since the 90s, players assume the role of Princess Zelda rather than Link. But this isn't the Philips CDI all over again, rather, this change results in a dramatically different sort of game that demands creativity and experimentation from the player. It's a game whose problems can all be solved using a wide range of tools. Of course, visually speaking, it's easy to draw comparisons to the 2019 remake of The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening for the Game Boy. That's because this new game seems to have been constructed using the very same technology and techniques that powered that game. I haven't yet made it to the credits, but it would indicate that, like the remake, this game was developed by Grezzo. Despite the high quality of the Link's Awakening remake, however, it was plagued by performance problems, as we covered in our original review, which is one of the key questions I had regarding this new game. Did they manage to overcome these issues? If not, how does it affect the game? All that and more is coming up on this video, so let's get into it. One of the first things I love about Echoes of Wisdom can be found right from its introduction. When you select the game from the Switch home screen, the system dips to black momentarily before instantly jumping into the game itself with a cutscene featuring Link wearing a cloak. You then take control and make your way through this dungeon of sorts before eventually facing off against your nemesis. It's at this point that Link is suddenly sucked into a rift, and as his last move, he fires off an arrow, freeing Princess Zelda in the process. And this is where you take control once again, tasked with escaping the dungeon as the rift continues to swallow up everything around you. Eventually you emerge, where it becomes clear that you're standing atop a version of Hyrule derived from the Super NES game, A Link to the Past. And this is one of the things that really piqued my interest right off the bat. It is very familiar at first glance. If you check out the map, it actually does line up fairly well with that game. But in reality, most of the map is effectively brand new. I actually started by drawing comparisons directly to the 16-bit game. Despite the similarities between the map layouts, the actual placement of everything and the size itself feel very different between the two games. While certain landmarks do line up, like this, the overall lay of the land is very different, and the map itself is expanded. I think they've found an excellent balance here in that you get those winks and nods referencing that Super NES game, yet it still feels decidedly new and fresh. This is in stark contrast to Link's Awakening, which was built specifically to recreate the Game Boy original on new hardware. But that meant carrying over certain limitations of the Game Boy, such as 90-degree angle walls. There's no slopes or varied terrain in that game, versus what we saw in A Link to the Past. Echoes of Wisdom embraces these features from A Link to the Past, but takes things even further, with complex terrain that can even require utilizing magic to traverse. The game also does away with the traditional barriers, things like being unable to swim in deep water till you get the specific power-up. In this game, Zelda can perform all these actions right from the start, which changes how you approach exploration. Really interesting stuff. What I didn't expect, however, was a shared villain between Link's Awakening and Echoes of Wisdom. I had hoped that Link might have defeated it once and for all, but unfortunately the true face of evil remains. The Lord of Darkness. Unstable frame rate. That's right, it's back. Essentially, all the problems I highlighted in Link's Awakening's review have returned in full force here. That is, the game bounces between 60 frames per second and 30 frames per second as you play, likely due to a reliance on double buffered vertical sync. This is exactly the behavior that I observed in that remake, but this time, it's even worse. So the first thing to consider here is that the actual game world itself is much larger than Link's Awakening and more complex. Given that it's larger and more seamless, it is perhaps unsurprising that the Switch struggles. But it's where it struggles that remains curious. You see, it's not just a case of, say, the GPU being too slow, rather it's more like a memory bandwidth issue or even a CPU one. To understand that, let's walk around in this area, right? You can see the frame rate is dipping, but if we stop in place and then use the right stick camera to move the camera around without actually walking, you'll see that the frame rate actually jumps right back up to 60 FPS. Once you begin to move again, however, you'll notice that it immediately drops back down to 30. So the issues are triggered by it moving through the world, which suggests that it's related to streaming in level data as you walk around. The frame rate is constantly going up and down as you play, so much so that it almost feels like they should have at least included an option to cap it at 30 frames per second if the user was so inclined. The main issue here is that this performance can have a detrimental effect on certain sections. Take the sand boss for instance, the second major dungeon I tackled. This required some experimentation to figure out how to take him down properly, but the issue is that every time the boss would unleash its powerful tornadoes, the frame rate would plummet. To me, this took away some of the joy of experimentation in a moment when you needed that performance the most. When looking at the game as a whole in terms of its design though, I basically found that the overworld areas and certain large boss encounters were often 30 frames per second, with pockets going up to 60 FPS. Dungeons, on the other hand, are almost entirely 60 FPS with occasional 30 FPS hiccups. So basically, most of the gameplay outside of the overworld is pretty smooth overall. Which sort of begs the question, will it bother you, the player? If you're someone that was annoyed by the issues in Link's Awakening, well, it's not better here, and in fact, it's often worse. If you had no issues with that game though, you'll probably be okay here. My main hope now is that the next Nintendo hardware platform will be able to boost games like this automatically, solving the performance issues in the process. The thing is though, the surrounding game is otherwise so extremely well made and interesting that you might be able to tolerate these problems and just enjoy the game even if you're bothered by them like I was. It's not just that you play as Zelda this time, rather it's what Zelda is capable of that makes this game so unique. Everything from combat to navigation to puzzle solving basically relies on her abilities to summon objects and characters with the flick of a staff. As you progress, you'll be able to memorize objects and foes and add them to your collection, which you can then bring up by holding right on the D-pad. It has a bit of that Breath of the Wild sort of freedom imbued within it, but with more focused overall level design. The key here is that puzzles in this game do not necessarily have a singular solution, and you can use this freedom to come up with creative ways to solve such challenges. The combat too has elements of this. You often need to summon creatures to do your bidding as you step back, lending it an almost strategic feel. That's not to say you can't engage in classic sword combat. There is a mechanic for this, though it is limited by a gauge by your life meter, but you'll spend most of your time putting your vast inventory to use. So when you consider the amount of stuff you can spawn and interact with, and the massive increase in world size, it's no wonder that Echoes of Wisdom struggles to deliver a stable frame rate. There's just a lot more going on per scene in pursuit of this flexibility. Then there's image quality. Here we're seeing the same metrics as Link's Awakening. Indoor scenes typically range between 972 up to native 1080p. But once outdoors, the resolution can drop as low as 720p in docked mode. So it is still quite variable based on load. It actually has the same behavior as Link's Awakening. When you leave a building, for instance, the initial frames outdoor will appear at 1080p, but then it quickly drops over the course of a few more frames. Despite this, thanks to the angle of the gameplay camera, I would say that image quality overall is quite good and certainly not a problem here. Unsurprisingly, the rest of the visuals fall very much in line with Link's Awakening's remake. You get that same miniature perspective with the depth of field creeping in along the edges, lending everything this tiny little feel. Those same chibi-sized characters running around the world are just as charming as before. Water looks great now and is used in more places. The world itself is certainly more complex, as I mentioned earlier. Walls are no longer constrained to 90-degree angles, and there's now slopes in the terrain, making everything feel more varied. All of this is to say that I think the visual design is excellent. I'm a big fan of it, and it feels like it's a good choice for a game like this. It really is just the frame rate woes that I have issue with. Now more than ever, it feels like we need a successor to the Nintendo Switch. But of course, visuals are only part of the package. The next thing I wanted to touch on is audio. You see, Echoes of Wisdom has a soundtrack design in the style of classic Zelda games, as opposed to more recent titles. What do I mean by that? Well, if you play something like Breath of the Wild or its sequel, the music is largely used in an atmospheric capacity. What I mean is, most of the gameplay has ambient sounds swirling around you, and the music only kicks in when it actually makes sense. Due to the size of those game worlds, constant music might actually have become annoying. But that's exactly what classic Zelda games always offered, a soundtrack that played during the gameplay all the time. And that's exactly what we get here. Since this is a new game, however, the soundtrack compositions themselves are also entirely new. Instrumentation-wise, it offers a sound very similar to the Link's Awakening remake, but the melodies are, of course, quite good and fresh. Maybe not as memorable as Link's Awakening, but still great stuff, so take a listen. It's pretty good stuff, I think, right? So, okay, with all this in mind then, I did enjoy my time with this new Zelda game and plan to see it through to the end. The fun of experimentation is a triumph, empowering players to solve puzzles as they choose, rather than following a fixed formula. It keeps the spirit of the series alive while presenting a decidedly different take on it. It's open, but not too open, which is key. It also doesn't push any visual boundaries, yet it still manages to produce an attractive, clean-looking image. However, it is not simple to brush aside the game's performance woes either. Nintendo published games this generation have largely managed to deliver solid, consistent levels of performance relative to the hardware, often exceeding expectations even, but I feel like in this case, Grezzo's goal for this game was simply too much for the Switch as we know it today. It certainly has me thinking about backwards compatibility features on Nintendo's next generation machine and whether they'll allow performance improvements like modern Xbox and PlayStation consoles. I certainly hope that's the case because games like this would benefit a lot. Because really, that is the primary flaw here, performance. The rest of this game is interesting and unique. I'm really impressed with what Grezzo was able to achieve here in terms of the overall design. I wasn't even completely sold on it initially either. The first couple hours, while good enough, contain a lot of bed stacking and flailing around as you try to figure out how it all works, but once you do obtain more usable items and enemies, the joy of the game becomes clear as day. But that's gonna do it for this video, so I hope you enjoyed it and we'll see you next time.